And welcome back, listeners. Thank you again for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast. And as is becoming very normal, I am joined here, as always, by Dr. Matt Eby, co-author of the Invisible Threat Podcast, but as well as, super excited about this, I love this trend, his better half, Joanne Eby, co-author of the Invisible Threat. Thank you guys both for being on here again with me. And we'll timestamp this here in a second and how I got a chance to actually see you guys just recently.
Yeah, Carter, it was great seeing you, and it was so much fun to have some discussions about the podcast that we're doing and reflecting about business opportunities and those kind of things. So yeah, it was so great to see you face to face, not just over the screen. So
Sure, not over the phone, not over text or whatever. So, Joanne, anytime I get a chance to be able to, to see you and get a chance for us to talk about family and friends and business. And it was funny. I actually asked you a question. So, Joanne, what's retirement like? And I love the answer. So, why don't you share a little bit about what your retirement looks like so far?
Well, I'm still doing work. So Matt is referring to it as pre-retirement. I think of it as practicing retirement, but I do like to keep busy, as you know, and passionate about the industry. And so just welcome opportunities to continue to help organizations where I can. So I'm loving it.
I love the story, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about what we've learned so far. A lot of the listeners, and again, thank you guys for coming on and listening to another episode. But we talked in that first episode. I remember a little bit about like how our history was, right, and how do we get to know each other. And I love sharing that story because I'll tell people, I'm like, look, here's the deal. You have to get introduced to Matt and Joanne Eby. You don't just stumble upon them. In fact, I can remember when I met you, you didn't even have a website at all, right? You have a website now and everything, and you've progressed. You're out there at least a little bit more. But whenever Gavin said to me, "Oh, you're thinking about starting your own trust company? Oh, well, you got to meet Matt and Joanne." And at the time, you guys actually lived in Vegas, so that was perfect timing for us to get together there. Anyway, I just always think about sharing that story about just how you've been your own best kept secret, I guess. Or maybe that was by design. I'm not sure which one it is.
there was just so much demand that we just were very selective on who we were going to work with. And in fact, as you know, we weren't going to work with you. So I was absolutely convinced going like, no, Joanne, we're not going to do this. And Joanne was convinced going like, I really like those guys. Like, let's make sure that this is a great, talking about, making discretionary decisions and those selections. And here we are many, many years later, really great friends and having the honor to be on a podcast together and delivering our message to the industry. So it's all worked out really, really well. So yeah, we thank our lucky stars that we were able to connect and that you through Earl Hopper, your CFO, delightful guy. And shout out to Earl for hanging in there with us and having the conversation with me to say that, yeah, we really need to do something together. So awesome.
And Joanne, I don't know if I've ever gotten it on record necessarily, but I would love for you to kind of give a little bit of an overview, and then maybe we'll kind of sort of get into what we learned in episode 2 and episode 3 and stuff like that. But I just love this story so much because, and you just alluded to it, Matt, like you weren't going to work with us, and then Earl. But share from your perspective, Joanne, because I think you really wanted to be able to work with us, and it looked like you weren't going to. But how did that end up transpiring?
Well, I think, Carter, if you recall the first time we met, it was at a restaurant in Las Vegas for lunch. And it just so happened, I think you and I were sitting across from each other, and Matt was conversing with Earl. They were talking B count or numbers and accounting and all that good stuff. And you and I were really just talking. And I was asking you sort of like very specific questions because you want to start a trust company. And it's like, yes, but do you? And just we had a great conversation. And one of the things that for me, I always, and Matt and I have had conversations with other people that want to start trust companies. And, it's not a simple or easy thing. And the real question was like, well, how do you want to approach it? Do you want to approach it because you think it's going to be easy and quick, or do you want to do it the right way? And you and I had a definite meeting of the minds, and you were just so convinced that if you were going to do this, you were going to do it the right way. And then even, yeah, after our lunch, and we drove you down to, I think, your next meeting, and that was, my takeaway. You seemed so sincere about that. And of course, pandemic happens. We're in Florida. A month or so later, get a call from Earl. And I had a great conversation with him. I probably chatted for 30 minutes and then hung up. And then Matt's like, "Who were you talking to?" I said, "Earl, this is great. And they want to hire us." And Matt was like, "Nope, absolutely not." And I have a vision of him relaxing on the lanai. I mean, we weren't getting calls for any work. The country was shut down. And Matt's like, "Nope." And I'm like, "No, you have to." And Matt was adamant. And I said, "Well, I can't be the one to tell him, because I just can't say no to the guy." And Matt's like, "I will say no." Set up the meeting. So I set up the meeting for the next day. Matt's like, and he goes to talk to, I couldn't even be in the same room to listen. I was heartbroken. And about a half hour later, Matt comes out and he goes, "Well, we're working with Earl and Carter."
Here was the exact quote. I said, "I have gum on my shoes."
You're good people. And that's the thing that struck me right away. And, knowing, and even with the trust company, knowing when to say now is not the right time, but you have a great business with Epic Services Company. And it's like, as you move forward, you may do it, you may not, you may connect with other, however it is you do it. What I liked was your ability to just think it through and then do what was right for not only your company, but your clients, your downstream clients. So kudos to you.
And I had no idea, right? I didn't know this until much, much later that we weren't going to be working together. And I thought, wait, that was a possibility actually. So that's why I love sharing that story, because, speaking of judgment, right? Speaking of discernment and thinking through from your own, and this is way before your dissertation, right? Dr. Matt, this was from your own perspective. Like, there's no way this is going to happen. Like, it was impossible for it to actually happen. And then for us now, many years later, as you mentioned earlier, not only business associates, but great friends. And I've said forever, life is way too short to want to work with people that you don't get along with. So at least work with people that you like. And it's been, honestly, it's been amazing for me. It's been amazing for my team and my staff. And, the things that we've been building here at Epic Services Company, lots of encouraging things that have been happening. The growth has been substantial. It's been so amazing to me on once I got completely focused on 100% Epic Services Company. But none of that would have happened had you not, I guess, been convinced by Earl. You brought him up. Shout out to Earl Hopper, CFO, convinced by him that, no, you don't understand, Matt. You're doing this. I can't even imagine what he said to you that you're like, all right, fine, I'll do it.
Well, this goes right into our episode 1. We're kind of doing a reflections here, and what I said was, and which is just very true. Why is this so important now? Right? Why are we talking about judgment now, and specifically fiduciary judgment? And so what happened is, and it's the essence of our book, the invisible threat that we have up here. It's going like the essence of our book is that we came out of a rules-based society prior to year 2000. And when rules were, in fiduciary services and financial services, when you had rules to follow, you just followed the rules. And then you had rules-based certainty, right? People were very comfortable and you just followed the rules. And what I said in episode 1 was that if the church and or the government and or your parents and or your grandparents, you just follow cultural rules, you just simply followed those rules. And I remember, these things specifically. And then what has gone on, and the rules have changed, the laws have changed, culture has changed, the society has changed so much that now you have judgment-based ambiguity. So you have to be so much better at exercising judgment now. And that goes across the entire society, potentially across the entire world. So everybody's opinion matters now individually. And this is exacerbated by social media and all these other kind of issues that are out there. But let's just stay in our own lane. In the fiduciary world, you have to be so much more knowledgeable about how to exercise judgment. And you have to make it so much more visible, or else you wind up down the road of the invisible threat. That's the basis of what we're talking about. And that's the reason why that individual judgment, whether or not that it's by one person or one committee or one organization, has to be made so much more visible now than it ever was in the past. Because you're allowed to do things now that you were never allowed to do in the past from a fiduciary perspective or from a trust perspective. That's what the invisible threat is about. That's what the podcast is about. We've moved from rules based certainty to judgment based ambiguity. And you have to just be so much better at doing that and making it much more visible. And we're telling you how to do it. We're telling you what happens. We're telling you why. And if you listen to the podcast or read the book or whatever, you'll know if you are in financial services, especially if you are a fiduciary. But that's not just where it is. Any place that you have responsibility for someone else, especially if they are weaker than you or whatever, like a parent, a teacher, or a judge, or a police officer, whatever, the same type of reasoning or the same type of process is in play. We're going to stay in our lane. As I said, we'll just talk about trustees and fiduciary, or, lawyers or estate people, or whatever, investment advisors. We'll stay there for right now because that's really what my dissertation was about. And that's what our episodes are about. We're talking about how you make that decision process, that judgment process visible, and then what happens when different things occur and when you get pressure or when somebody's criticizing you, or like we talked about with, we had the examiner come in the room and we were talking about the manager worrying about his reputation, right? Those are the things that happen in our episodes here. And so as we're going into this, right? And at the very beginning in episode 2, when you were talking about the difference between your role as being the facilitator of our podcast. Well, you wanted to have more of a voice, rightfully so, right? But I said, hey, wait a minute. We've had an agreement at the beginning of this, and we don't want to change it right away. I want you to abide by your decision. And you were saying, hang on a second, Matt. I want to have more of a voice and more ownership in this. I want to be seen more as a partner in this arrangement. And as it was very reasonable, and we demonstrated at that point in time that you weren't wrong and neither was I. And one of the things that came out of that, and what we have shown our audience, our listeners, is that disagreement is not divisive
Mhm.
unless you allow it to become extremely emotional. But we controlled for our emotions in that episode, and we showed how disagreement became data. Extremely important. So we're making the argument that, and demonstrated that any disagreement, not only is it data, extremely valuable. I want you to feel comfortable enough and trust me enough to, when you feel that you want to disagree with something that I've said, like Joanne did at the opening. She said, I disagree with that. We should go all the way into a case study here. So we just made fun of it, right? We played with the ideas, going like, okay, well, she's the boss and I live here and all that kind of stuff, right? It was just a game. And
Yeah.
therefore, it winds up being, let's consider why that is. And she picked up 3 documents and said, we don't have it built out enough yet. So we have to respect her. She's an expert in this. We have to respect her positioning in that, right? The
Yep.
moment just before the decision is come to, that's where judgment is really made sound. And I want to respect her in that so that she feels that she is trusted, right? And that the value that she brings is brought out. But not only that, your value is brought out too. And we open that up to the people that are in the podcast, right? They're experts in this. And we want to trust that feeling and make it safe for them to feel that they can add value to the conversation. That's why disagreement is data. And so it becomes so much of a better conversation when everybody can participate and demonstrate that, which we showed in episode 2 and 3.
Well, and speaking of episode 2, what was so awesome about that is that unbeknownst to our listeners, we're doing reflections today, right? Unbeknownst to our listeners, that was by design, right? Like we got in there so that we could get that tension that's happening. And the E and A fire, that's the part, and I know we're going to get really deep into this throughout this entire Invisible Threat podcast, but that emotional part of it, that's where things get a little sideways because people are emotional human beings. But what I loved is how we introduced that in a framework between the two of us in episode 2, and you could feel the tension. Like when you re-listen to it, you could feel the tension. You could be like, where's this going? What's happening
Yeah.
right now?
Yeah.
And again, it was awesome because it's not like we go, hey, by the way, this is what's getting ready to happen. No, we let everybody feel that. We said goodbye. And listeners, when they were listening to episode 2, or if in the future, someone who starts listening to this podcast and they're going to listen to it, in sequence, episode 1, then they get episode 2, and they're like, how is there's 80 episodes? How did they get past episode 2? Because then they get into episode 3 and 4, and then they really understand the purpose behind that. And that was just so awesome to be a part of.
Well, like I said, my sister, who I've referred to as, she could not tolerate the tension, right? And even though that I told her after the fact that it's staged, right? But even so, because my sister is a very sensitive person, she winds up where she can't tolerate that tension, and many people cannot, right? And when they're in that tension, they simply have to close it because they're taught that that is incorrect, right? There's something wrong when you can't agree. But when you force the agreement, so had Joanne and I gone on with the discussion about the case study, right? And had I forced her into the case study, then that would have been a worse decision because she would have felt that, one, wasn't respected, and two, that it wasn't the best case for us because we didn't add the additional elements in it, right? The additional pieces in the documents that she showed. So we didn't take the time to add those pieces in there, right? It's not the best judgment for the value of the podcast. And that's what happens. It compresses it. So all we get is anchors and risk and not fairness of Joanne's additional advice, plus the identity of having her as a valued member of the team. That's the point. And that's like episode 4 or 5. So we talk about the compression of what happens normally in the meetings because we don't allow for the fairness to surface. And how many times have you been in meetings where a person or 2 or 3 people just get quiet? They don't want to raise their hand because they're the ones that get squashed. And it's only the two people that are fighting with each other, the chief compliance officer and the president of the organization, who tend to be men, right? And they fight with each other until both of them are just angry. And then the person with the most power just overrules everybody else. And the person who has maybe the best idea just remains quiet. And they simply just want to close it and get past it. That's why when we get close at end of our sessions, we say most people finish, we don't. And that's what we're trying to emphasize in that.
So, Carter, one of the favorite lines it might have been episode 4, and it was 4 or 5, and you were the manager and you were concerned because you were hearing something that you really didn't want to hear. And then
Yep.
it was what you said, and I remember it vividly because it was so real to you, even though it was a case study, but it was so real to you because you said, "Are you saying it's a Carter problem?" And it was a moment that in a lot of meetings, it's just like, "Yes, you're the and then that fight would start. Instead, it's like the moment allowed to sit, and you had said it, and then you had also realized, like, because if the room can hold those moments, then you're able to work through them. But that line and the way you said it was just, it really resonated to me. And even just in listening to the podcast again, it's like, yeah, like you nailed it. It's like, because I've heard that, Matt's heard that in so many like memes. Are you saying it's not my problem? And just then the fight would ensue.
We go through and we say, our acronym is AFIRE, but anchors don't lead, emotion leads. It's always emotion that leads. People are very emotional, they're not rational beings, they're emotional beings, and emotion always leads. And whether or not that it's happy or sad or fear or anger or whatever it is, emotion always leads. And until you can control that emotion, and it really winds up where you have to invite people to feel like they're part of it, even if it's an individual doing it themselves. If they have ambiguity, they're not sure they're making the right call. And they're always taking all this different stuff into their head when they're going and trying to make decisions in ambiguity, especially if they have a responsibility for somebody else. In the case of a fiduciary type of arrangement, whether or not that it's a beneficiary or it's, like I said before, a student who is a minor or a child who is a minor or whatever, there's no written rules for parents, right? That's the issue. And it winds up where in that sense of ambiguity, you're making a call that's going to have an effect. And that's why it's important to go through the exercise of all four of those dimensions. So you're looking at it to make the best decision or the best judgment that you possibly can. And if you go through the compass, you don't normally draw it out, but you can feel those issues that are, coming out of there, and understanding that if one of them is, quiet, that you're going to compress the other ones. And that's why the A-fire compass is such a critical aspect of the judgment, we're talking about.
And what I loved about to kind of finish up this summation of the first few episodes that we had, in episode 8, we were talking about assumptions. And the old phrase of what happens when you assume. By introducing assumptions in the judgment aspect of everything and how that can drive decisions one way or another, being able to introduce that into the show as well, on how that can affect a lot of things, right? Positively, negatively, quietly. And that's where we kind of sort of left off. Our last episode was really about those assumptions. So, as we continue to reflect on all of these episodes and continue to pull out all of that industry knowledge between the two of you, our listeners are going to hear things that, quite honestly, they would never hear anywhere else.
I've never heard any of this before. And as I said, when I first started this out and talking about, the invisible threat, when Joanne and I put this together, we saw it because of our experience in the industry. We saw the change from the rules-based certainty prior to year 2000, and then after it, when the different firms moved into the fiduciary industry and how it all changed over, right? And we had this ambiguity, and the decisions that were, or the judgment that was being made was not the same judgment that was done prior to the change in the law. When the new industry, RIAs and broker dealers, securities firms got involved with trust industry, it became very, very different, which we explain in the book. Then when I went through the process of the dissertation and did the research to understand the underlying reason why, and then the A-fire dimensions came out, which all emerged from that research. Now we have the certainty to back it up where because it is empirical data. So it winds up where it's not opinion any longer, it's backed by the research. So we've seen this emerge from, those from that work. So that's why we've overlaid the empirical data with the book, and it's driven this podcast, and that's where we're getting this information from, right? So
Yeah.
it's supported by the research.
Yeah.
Of the episodes that you've already done, what has been, and I don't know if the right question is what's been your favorite or what's been your biggest takeaway? Like, has there been something where you were like, after we did the podcast and you're like, oh my gosh, and then you're talking to, Christine going, oh my gosh, mind blown or something like, so what has your experience been so far?
That's such a great question. I get so much out of each and every single one of these, and I'm so obviously wrapped up into it during the recording of the sessions and everything that I have to sometimes go back and reflect. And unfortunately, I've only done that a couple of times, so I can't even give you a specific episode other than episode 2. I just remember episode 2 so clearly that's my biggest takeaway. But I will tell you this in general, every single time I get done with an episode, after I'm done recording it, and typically it's in my my home office or my office. I'm at home office today, but usually in my office where me and Christina are in the same building together, I'll be like, bye, everybody. See you later. See you next week. Right. And then I'll go over to Christina and I'm like, Matt is just so awesome. He's so amazing. He gives me all this information. And I'm just like, this podcast is just so amazing to be a part of. That's like every single time I get done, I'm re-energized. I just want to say that when the book came out, my clarity on what direction I was going wasn't there. And if it wasn't for the timing of the book being released and you going, oh, hey, Carter, make sure you read the chapters where you're in it. Read this chapter and then read this chapter. I got done reading those chapters and I'm like, let's go, baby. I was re-energized.
Yeah.
And that's how I feel after every single episode that we do together. All right. So what I want to do actually next, and again, once again, listeners, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast. Speaking of the listeners, I want to go right at the question that I think every listener is probably asking themselves right now, right? We've talked a lot about tension, disagreement, orientation, assumptions that I just mentioned earlier, right? But let's make this real. If I'm myself sitting in committee or I'm reviewing a beneficiary request, Matt, how do I actually use the information from these podcasts that our listeners are getting?
Well, Carter, I agree with you. I think that's a great question. If I was listening to this, that's exactly what I would want to know. And the first thing is, you don't start where most people will start.
Where do you start then? Which is what?
Well, you don't start with just solving.
Most people think the job is to get to an answer. But in fiduciary work, the first job is to understand what is shaping that answer.
And as we've said a lot, if you solve too quickly, meaning if you close too quickly, you actually solve the wrong problem very well.
Yeah, which exacerbates the issue in the first place, right? Solving the wrong problem very well. So what's the first thing I should actually be looking for?
Well, as we mentioned in the last podcast, you're looking for that moment.
So what do you mean by that, though? I'm confused. We're looking for the moment. Like, does it hit you like a ton of bricks, or how do you see that moment?
If you're not looking for it or listening for it, in a lot of rooms, they're just focused on speed and decisions and quick, quick, quick. But if you are able to do it, it's the moment where you feel that shift, the shift in the situation or the tone of the room, something will tighten. There's that moment. And it's when someone gets quieter, when the conversation moves, and often it moves from exploring to all of a sudden defending and people having to defend their positions. That's a signal. And as we know from the other podcasts, it's like Disagreement is data. And so if people are suddenly starting to defend their position, they're taking a position and they're defending it. That's a signal, what we have called the moment. And if you're able to hold that moment as opposed to trying to shut it down, it's like, oh, look, everybody, let's get on the same page. Don't do that. Just hold that moment. And it's also when if suddenly something feels like something needs to be protected, like all of a sudden, you're in a meeting and you feel like you're having to defend your argument and you're managing your exposure.
So here's the deal. I recognize the moment, right? But now what?
Well, just like Joanne just said, you have to make sure that you slow it down.
So when I slow it down, what is it that I'm actually doing and do what?
You're changing the question. You have to ask a different question. The question isn't, what should we do? But remember, we're asking, what is pulling on us right now?
And you can hear it if you listen carefully, Carter. If someone says, that's what the document says, that's the anchors. Someone else might say, we treated others the same way. That's fairness. If someone says, how will this make us look? Like, what what are we taking on? What are we agreeing to? That's your risk. And if someone says, as trustee, we have a duty. You hear that frequently in trust committee meetings, especially. We have a fiduciary duty. That's identity.
You don't find or see the compass by drawing it. You find it by listening to what people are protecting.
Well, this is where it starts to feel for sure uncomfortable though, right?
Exactly. And that discomfort, you should start to make that feel like a good moment because there's disagreement. And so there's something to be learned from that.
Yeah, and as we talked about earlier in the episode, we talk about emotions, right? And being uncomfortable, that's an emotion, right? That causes a lot of things to happen. So because now you can feel that emotion, if you will, of all of it at the same time, right?
We've referred to that as tension. And that tension, that's what Joanne described in the last episode as the gate.
And this is where most systems fail. They don't make the wrong decision necessarily, but they're closing that moment too quickly. They want to move past it.
And I feel like sometimes they want to move past it, obviously, because it's again going back to that emotional part, right? Like people aren't comfortable being uncomfortable, right? So what does it actually look like then to hold it?
Well, it's very simple, but also very difficult. You don't rush to agreement. You don't collapse the options. You let multiple reasonable paths stay visible.
You might even want to say it out loud. Say, there are at least two responsible ways to handle this. Or let's understand both positions before we move or make a decision on this.
As we were doing the reflections and everything too, we talked about episode 8 about assumptions. So where do assumptions come in then at this point?
The assumptions actually come in right there. Because once the tension is held, the assumptions will start to show themselves.
And by showing themselves, how does that actually happen?
The assumptions sound like certainty. For example, we assume that if we approve this, we'll have to approve everything that looks like this in the future. Or this is how we've always done other cases in the past. We need to do this the same way. Or this is the safest approach, the least risky for our organization. Those are all assumptions.
And instead of simply just accepting all of those assumptions at face value,
You want to test them to see if those assumptions are in fact still valid.
and the quality of fiduciary judgment is directly tied to the quality of the assumptions you're willing to question.
So only after all of that, right, you have fully exercised your fiduciary duty.
Exactly. And now it's a completely different kind of judgment.
And when Matt says completely different, what he's saying is it wasn't just simply reactive. The room didn't just react. What you're seeing is that there's full exercise of fiduciary discretion, fiduciary judgment. And the goal is not to remove the tension, it's to use that tension to make a fiduciary judgment that can hold and withstand that tension. That's a quality judgment.
So let me just make sure that I've got this straight then. So I don't rush to solve. I recognize when the moment shifts. I name what's pulling us in a certain direction. I hold the tension. I surface the assumptions. And then I have fully met my duty when exercising discretion.
It sounds like a lot, and you are right. That is a solid yes on that.
But what you've described is fiduciary judgment.
Yeah, and that sounds simple when you say it, right? But I can already tell that is not easy.
You're correct. It is not easy. However, let me just say it's not hard because it's complex. It's hard because it requires you to stay in an uncomfortable moment that most people are trained to and desire to escape from.
I talk all the time, not to get off topic here too much, but I talk about how our son with golf, you got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think that's just nature. It's human nature. And most people, to close that moment quickly, right? They want to go ahead and close that moment quickly. But here's the deal, listeners. Most people look to close that moment immediately. We don't. Thank you guys so much for listening again today. We really do appreciate you coming in and getting all of this amazing knowledge here at the Invisible Threat podcast. And as is normal, make sure to wherever you get your podcasts, like, share, and subscribe to the Invisible Threat podcast. And we really want to welcome you back every single chance that we get to be able to impart the wisdom that we promise you will not hear anywhere else. So for my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Matt Eby and co-author of The Invisible Threat, Joanne Eby, I want to thank you both for being a part of this, to impart your wisdom and give this immense knowledge that you've acquired over however many decades it is now, right? So thank you guys again for being a part of this.
Thank you so much, Carter. It's always a great experience, and we really, really enjoy the time with you. And Joanne, thanks for all of your insights. As I've said so many times, there's no one better than Joanne.
Thank you.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So until next time, listeners, we will see you on the Invisible Threat podcast. Thank you, everybody.